Welcome everybody, thanks for being here. Thank you, Susan, for being here with us in Colombia and in La Sabana University. It's a pleasure, and I'm really happy a lot of my students are sitting in these chairs because we're gonna have a lot of conversations in class, and because we have, in the ones that have already gone through my courses, we have had many of the talks or the topics you're gonna address today. We discussed them in class, so it's great having another female in the stage, sharing all her strength and her knowledge and the way they did the teamwork. So the way this is gonna work, you guys, is Susan's gonna tackle different areas of how the investigation was developed, and I'm gonna ask her some questions as she goes, and then we'll have a space for you to ask all the questions you may have. So please write them down, have them in your mind, and be sure to make them when we have the space. Okay, so there you go, Susan. Please share with us everything about the Gupta Leaks.
Great. So let me just start with, this is us. This is our team. We're a non-profit organization called Amabungane, and I'll show you on the next slide what that means and why we've got a dung beetle as a logo. But this is our team. We're 4 full-time journalists, 2 managing partners, and then various admin people. But for a South African newsroom, we're a relatively small organization. We were initially formed as part, a sort of separate unit inside a newspaper in South Africa, and then eventually started the process of splitting away. And now we're at a stage where we publish online on our own website, but we also publish with other publishing partners. But the main thing is that we are entirely donor funded. We don't take advertising. That's our model that we're trying to drive and to pioneer in South Africa.
Do you have a model that is similar to the ProPublica one, where donors don't know what you're investigating and they just donate, or they're like sponsors that donate a specific topic? Because we have both models here in Colombia, and we don't know yet which one is better.
So the part of our kind of our push to show that we're independent, one of the conditions that we have is that we're very strict about who we take funding from. And also that one of the conditions is that the funders have no say in what we investigate. Even if someone says to us, we feel that environmental issues are not getting enough attention, we want to donate to you so that you can investigate more environmental issues. Even in that situation, we have to say we can't take the funding, because even that would, to us, look like someone was directing what we're investigating. So we're quite strict about that. We also don't take money from corporates. We don't take money from organizations, from government organizations either. We've even sort of certain controversial figures in South Africa, we've had to say thanks very much and return the money. But it's a policy that we're feeling out as we go. There isn't another organization in South Africa that's tried it. So, we have to keep adapting the policy and saying what works. Do we need to change this? How do we deal with it when a family trust wants to donate? So, it's not quite making it up as we go along, but we're feeling our way through it.
Okay, perfect.
So this is who we are. Amabungane. It's a Zulu word. It means dung beetles. And I'm not sure if dung beetles are, if you have them in Colombia, but basically, so the idea with the dung beetle is that, it takes the dung from animals, it rolls it up and buries it underground, which has a kind of dual purpose of fertilizing the soil and then also helping plants to germinate. And that's the idea of what we do. So our slogan is digging dung, fertilizing democracy. And as you can see, this was a cartoon drawn by one of the local cartoonists in South Africa. That's one of our managing partners, Sam Sol, as a dung beetle, hard at work. And the ball of dung, the shit that's about to hit the fan, is made up of all of the scandals that have been rolled together. The 2 particular characters here were from the state electricity company, Eskom, that we had been investigating for some time. So this is the investigation that we're probably best known for. It's sort of the reason why I'm here in Colombia, I guess. It's called the Gupta Leaks. It's named after a family of businessmen in South Africa who were able to capture the state. And I'll explain it a little bit more a little bit later. But effectively what it was a trove of information, a hard drive with around 200,000 emails on it. We're not actually sure how many emails are on there, partly because there were a lot of duplicates that we had to strip out, and partly because the drive, which we were given a copy of, had been damaged. And so at the latest count, the techies that have managed to get hold of the drive for the State Capture Commission, they say that they're up to about 1 million emails, but we've seen a portion of that, not all of it. So a little bit about, because this is often a question that we get asked, is how we go about finding our stories. And I've put sort of 4 main categories down. I mean, the first one would be the basics. There's a service delivery protests, that we have a lot of those in South Africa, where protests which can often turn quite violent, where government hasn't delivered services, where there's been corruption within municipalities. So that would be one basic source where we would look for our stories. We would see something happening and we would go and speak to people on the ground and say, okay, so there's been no delivery of houses. Where is the housing budget gone? And we'll start investigating in that way. I mean, the advantage of those types of stories is that you immediately are in contact with real people on the ground. You have real narratives that are not just a nice to have in a story, particularly for quite dense investigative stories. If people don't relate to your stories, they're not going to read them and they're not going to have impact. So that can be a real advantage, starting in that way. But it is often, I found it's often a bit of a needle in a haystack, because you can have a protest on the ground. People can know that they're angry because there's been no delivery of houses or toilets or education or whatever it is. They're not necessarily, they're possibly going to be the furthest away from the person who's taken the money. So it can be a very long process, can be very time consuming. And the difficulty for us is that because our mandate is purely investigative journalism, we don't really have the space to tell just the stories which are about, the narrative stories about what's happening in the country, a report back on issues on the ground, the in-depth features. That's not within our mandate. So this is often not our first port of call as a story. Probably the place where we most commonly get our stories is that someone comes to us either with evidence, documents, recordings, whatever it might be, or just with details of an allegation of corruption that's happening. Obviously, those stories tend to be, you can turn them around faster. You've got a far greater chance of that turning into a viable story, because you're not having to go and try and find where the corruption is happening. Mm-hmm. There's someone who's standing there and saying, that over there is where the corruption's happening. The problem, of course, is that you don't necessarily know that the person who's pointing you in that direction is giving you the full picture.
Yes, that was going to be my question. How do you trust them?
So really, I mean, it's a really difficult one. I think particularly in South Africa, as the media houses have all been cut down, the budgets have been cut, more and more journalists are relying on this type of investigative journalism, the quick hits that deliver better returns and deliver them faster. The difficulty is that it leaves the entire profession wide open to manipulation.
Yes.
And particularly in South Africa, where we have, these kind of factional political battles raging the whole time, there's always someone who's willing to hand over a document and leak if it's against someone else. So I think it's definitely, it's a very productive area, but it's one where I think the South African media in general has had its fingers burnt and has had to learn some hard lessons about the dangers of relying too heavily on the person who anonymously turns up with an envelope with five documents in them.
And would you do any kind of background check or anything? Because I used to have this journalism teacher who used to say, like, the best sources are like the widowers, the ones that are hurting or have been cheated on, like they are hurting because of something. Because they'll tell you everything. They'll spill the tea and say everything about it. But then again, you need to know what the issue was with them so you can know where the limit is. Do you do any kind of background checks or get to know the sources before you trust them? Or you just like start rolling with the story and then try and figure out how it all matches?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the huge advantages that we have as an organization, because, you know, we effectively have no publishing deadlines. We don't have, you know, you must have a story done by this Friday. If the story takes 3 months, it takes 3 months, and the editors say that's fine. So that really gives us that time to not just rely on one source, but to start approaching the story from multiple angles, developing multiple sources, so that we can kind of cross-reference and check whether the picture that we're being given is the full picture or whether it is, a kind of
biased,
a biased view. Yeah. But I mean, I must say, having worked before in a kind of more traditional newsroom, I think that's a problem that journalists aren't being given that time.
Yes, that is
true. The temptation often from editors is like, well, you have the evidence. Why do you want to go and ask questions about it? But I mean, that's one of the things that we definitely and sources get very frustrated with us. We've lost a number of stories by saying to them, no, we're not just going to publish. We're going to take our time and investigate. And what we often do see is that the same documents that we are given might then suddenly be given to the Sunday newspapers.
Okay.
There's a tradition in South Africa that if you want something to come out without anyone asking too many questions, you go and deliver it on a Friday to the Sunday newspapers, and you tell them that the other ones got it, and they, out of panic that they're going to lose the story, will tend to publish. So it's a bad tradition, but unfortunately people, in powerful positions know that, and they know that it can be manipulated, that situation.
The good thing is you can do a better story by Wednesday and say, well, you got it wrong on Sunday. This is a true story, right?
That's true. Yeah, we don't often make friends by pointing out how people have got things wrong. But yeah, it's the way we prefer to operate, even if it means losing the story. So another source of stories for us is the leaks, the kind of large dumps of data. What we saw particularly in sort of 2016, 2017, is that we started getting more and more of these types of leaks, large amounts of information. And I can't be sure, but my theory is that people within government were starting to panic. They were starting to feel that this is not just going to sort itself out internally, that things were getting so bad that they felt the only way is to go outside of, whether it's outside of the political party, outside of the government department, whatever it is, and start placing that information out there. I love these types of sources of information because it gives you, your narratives are not determined, or you don't have sources trying to dictate the narrative of your story. It allows you to go in there, to dig, to find multiple stories, to come to your own conclusions based on the evidence. And it's also just a fantastic sort of trove of information. I will say, though, that the colleagues of mine who've worked on things like the Panama Papers and things like that, much more difficult, because it's for instance, with the Gupta Leaks, we had one organization and we knew a lot about that organization already, so we knew what to look for. Whereas something like the Panama Papers can be really tough, because it's a needle in a haystack. You don't know what you're looking for. And so often those types of leaks are sort of, I often feel are better as sort of reference leaks that you can dip into over and over again as you need information. But I know colleagues who've had a really tough time, extracting stories from those types of leaks. I mean, another way that we get large dumps of information would be through, it's what's called PIA in South Africa. It's the equivalent of FOIA.
Okay, yes.
So it's just our way of being able to go to the government and say, give us this information. They often refuse, and we often have to go to court. They will often capitulate on the steps of the court and will just hand us the information. That's sometimes a 2-year process. But it's one of the things that, I like to keep a kind of a whiteboard behind my desk, which has a a kind of running tally of things that I've asked for, knowing that they're not going to come in time for the story that I want to write in a month's time. But in 6 months, maybe I'll get what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's one of the tips I think we teach students here is just use your FOIA requests and keep asking every week for something. It doesn't matter if at first you don't know what the story is. Ask for as many things as you can and just keep the database around and keep asking questions because you don't know what's going to pop up, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's an interesting one. How effective is your system in Colombia for accessing information?
It depends who you're going to ask the information to. So the upper governments, such as ministries and policemen and the armed forces, they know how to implement the law because we have a law, and that's beautiful. And they tend to find the way to give you as much as they have to and keep as much as they can. But they usually, since these requests are usually answered by the communications department, then you most of the time get what you want because you don't have to tell them exactly what you are going to use it for. You can always say, oh, I'm a student and I'm just curious about my country. And that'll be enough, right? But then again, as you go deeper into like small communities or small government areas, then that's crazy because they don't know the law in the first place. And then we've had for years a policy of I'll keep the information to myself because that's the way I protect my boss or the work I'm doing, and why are you sniffing around asking things that I'm not going to give you. So we are still doing kind of an evangelization issue with these government people or even companies that use resources from the state, saying like, well, maybe you don't know, but we have a law since 5 years ago and you should give us this, I'll teach you how to. And then there has been a lot, in my experience, like maybe 5 cases where information was denied on not a legal basis, and we had the opportunity to go to court, but then the judiciary system in Colombia is just crazy. So if you can find someone else who has the information and can give it to you, then go that way. Because if you go to court, then it'll be maybe 10 years until you get the information.
Wow.
And that's not used. But we have been able to get great stories from FOIA requests here, yes.
I mean, one of the interesting ones, I think, quite early on in the Zuma presidency was the government tried the tactic with Amabongani where we had requested records of, so President Zuma, at the time, he had a rural homestead which had been built up. I think it was around 260 million rands worth of taxpayers' money had gone into building his private home. And when journalists wanted records of it, they fought the PIA request for a really long time and then decided to just overload us with information and gave us 14,000 pages of documents, which is obviously a terrible idea to do that with journalists, because of course we'll find the time to go through them.
Because we know how to use data in technology to find the questions, right?
So unfortunately, I think the government in South Africa is wise to that one. They're not making that mistake anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, it's one of my sort of, I've had a fun 2 years digging through various leaks. I think
40,000 documents are just, that's a mind goal.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. The last sort of thing around where we would locate our stories would be where we decide that a particular issue or a particular person, a particular company is of such it's of such significance that it warrants a targeted investigation. It's obviously very controversial to do that because you have to kind of police your own bias about who are you deciding to investigate. This guy here, this was a South African company, a sort of darling of the stock exchange. Every pension fund in the country was invested in it. Marcus Jooste was the CEO of this company, Steinhoff. It collapsed in spectacular fashion, taking masses of pension money with it. It turned out there was massive fraud going on inside the company. So this was a case where we felt justified in saying, you know, we don't have any leads, but this is something that we need to investigate. And one of my colleagues, Craig, took it on and spent 3 months and uncovered an incredible amount of information. But very difficult. These, you know, I remember him saying, you know, you start these investigations and you just don't know if you're going to have anything at the end of 3 months to show for it because, you know, you can go knocking on doors and come up with nothing. He got very, very lucky with a couple of sources that provided him with information. But at one point where he was stuck on this story, he actually said, let's put out a call to the public. You know, it's no secret that this company is in crisis. The company was,
Yes.
you know, being investigated. It had, you know, its audited financials had been recalled. There were investigations all over the world. Let's put out a call on social media and say, do you know anything? We are looking for this specific information. We're looking for connections between this person and this person. And he got a lot of new sources that way. It was actually very effective.
And do you do this a lot? Like you ask for the collaboration of the public?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we're experimenting with. Generally, we will ask on sort of broad topics. So, for instance, I've just published a story around how one particular company was funding the ruling party and was using all of these different means to channel money to the ruling party. And so in a situation like that, what we'll often do is we'll put together a short little video clip which we film, you know, with our own cell phones in the office, because we don't have a multimedia team, we do it ourselves. And we'll say, look, if you know about other companies that are funding other political parties, you know, come forward with information. And sometimes people do. It's often, you know, a bit hit and miss, but it's something, you know, when you have big issues like that, something like political party funding, the influence of money in politics is always going to be an issue. It's something that you can just keep reminding people about,
Yes.
and putting up a flag and saying, we're interested in this. And I think that's quite useful.
And how do you give the people the assurance they'll be safe when giving the information? Like, do you use PGP keys, or do you have like a safe Dropbox?
Yeah, I mean, it's we had initially, I mean, PGP is fantastic for kind of, you know, where we're communicating within the office, and it's quite useful because we have, although we're a very small team, we're spread across 3 cities. So we do need things like PGP for that type of thing. Very few members of the public who are going to come to us with information are going to be sussed enough to use PGP, and I've tried to explain to people how to install it. It's a nightmare. So I understand. Look, we do say to people, if it's sensitive information, try to use a disposable email address. Try to use an encrypted email, you know, something like Tutanota or something like that. We also give our cell phone numbers on the website, and you know, we encourage people not to call us at all, because phone records are very susceptible in South Africa. WhatsApp is a little bit safer. We don't have any reason to necessarily suspect that people are able, or that players within South Africa are able to read the contents of WhatsApps, but we will try and encourage people to rather use something like Signal. We do also have a sort of anonymous portal on our website where people can come. They don't have to they don't have to register, they don't have to leave an email address, anything. They can attach documents if they want. If they want to leave their details, they can. But if they want to literally just send us a one line and say, by the way, you should look at this contract, then that's what they can do.
Enough. That's
and
great.
That's actually been a really useful portal. But yeah, I mean, I think we're feeling it out as we go. You know, the difficulty now, the difficulty that we had with the Gupta Leaks is that we just don't know the security capabilities of the state in South Africa. For instance, there's a South African company which is very involved in kind of being able to intercept communications for governments, being able to grab large amounts of data without going through any kind of court process to do that. So there are reasons to be worried that the state would have those capabilities, but yeah, we just don't know.
Okay.
So this is kind of how we sort of tend to set priorities. We set them once a year, and then on a sort of ad hoc basis as we go. The one on the left, which I'm hoping is also your left, is sort of, you know, jokingly referred to as Amabungane's circle of hate, but it's basically just a way for us to say, you know, the stories that fall in the crossover point between these 3 things, between crime, business, and politics, that's really our sweet spot. Generally, I would say that where we spend most of our time investigating is the intersection between politics and business. I would really like to be able to move to the diagram on the right, but the problem is that politics in South Africa keeps us so busy that unfortunately we're not getting a chance to really get to the environmental stories. But that's sort of essentially how we work: is we come up with an idea of what our priorities are that we're going to investigate. It doesn't mean that you can't investigate something outside of those priorities, but everyone kind of has a sense of what the core issues are that we pursue. So, a bit of context. South Africa, this was our President Jacob Zuma. He was elected in 2009, came into power having very narrowly escaped prosecution on a massive number of corruption charges relating to, the allegation was that he had essentially taken a bribe from a French arms company in order to shield them from prosecution. So he came into power as a kind of populist nationalist leader, facing huge charges of corruption. And the book, which is on the right, kind of describes it best. I mean, the book was essentially about the people who had gathered around Zuma and who were using his kind of autocratic presidency to extract money from the state. Okay. Now, the term we eventually developed for that, I'm just going to skip one slide quickly, was state capture. I don't know if that's a common term that would be used in Colombia, but I mean, effectively, what it means is it's about the repurposing of the state for private interests, and literally the idea that the state is no longer working for its citizens. The state is issuing contracts, is engaging in capital build projects in order to make certain people rich, and not because necessarily, we need to buy 1,000 trains. Okay. That's sort of the term that we had developed.
I don't think we have used that term before in the media. I don't think we've seen it, but I think we could use it with other projects for sure. And yeah, I think we have examples of it.
I suspect, it's a common enough phenomenon, even if it's not kind of called by the same term. So the key kind of architects, and the important thing is that these guys were not the only ones who were engaging in state capture. There were a number of people who had sort of gathered around, kind of financial backers that had gathered around the president. But these guys had really perfected the art of it. These are the three Gupta brothers, who had come to South Africa in the 1990s from India, and who had initially started by selling shoes, and then had developed an IT company, and had sort of built an empire with this IT company. The guy on the right is Salim Essa, who essentially, he's a South African guy, but he essentially became the fourth Gupta brother. Okay. That he was so well integrated into their empire. Now, the Guptas had made a smart decision. When they came to South Africa, they had used politics, they had started quite early on using politics to kind of build their businesses. But in 2008, they spotted an opportunity. Zuma, before he became president in 2009, had briefly been fired by the then president, Thabo Mbeki, because of the corruption charges that he was facing.
Against him. Like he was part of the government and then fired.
He was the deputy president and was fired.
What does a deputy president do in South Africa? Because we don't have that figure here.
Oh, okay. I mean, look, it's a good question. It depends on the deputy president. They can do quite a lot. They can be the sort of enforcer, the person who runs around and gets stuff done, depending on who the president is. But they can also just be a sort of purely ceremonial figure. And I think we've kind of had, we've had options. We've had both.
What kind of deputy was Zuma? Like more of a go all hands on deck, or more?
No, I mean Zuma. He's an incredibly, and we saw that recently because he recently had to appear at a commission of inquiry. He's an incredibly paranoid, scheming kind of an individual. I'm not quite sure how best to put it. He had been, during apartheid, he had been the ANC's chief of intelligence. Okay. And he brought that mentality with him to government. that mentality of kind of spy versus spy. And effectively, in 2008, you had this factional battle which was ripping apart the ANC, with Zuma and the then president going in opposite directions. But anyway, the Guptas had spotted an opportunity. Zuma was out briefly in the political wilderness, and they saw an opportunity, knowing who Zuma was, he was not going to just quietly retire. He was going to find a way back in. But at that point, he had very few friends in politics. And the Guptas decided to befriend him. And the way that they did that was by befriending and going into business with one of his sons. And we could actually see that one of the things that we did at one stage was to get the share registers of all of the Gupta companies, which, we have a process in South Africa that you can go and request the share registers.
Do you have to pay for them?
You don't have to. Well, they can make you pay 100 Rand per share register. Most companies don't know that they can do that, so they just kind of give you the share registers. It's an incredibly archaic system because they are not contained in a central database somewhere. They are literally contained in handwritten books, which are kept at the company's premises. It is insanity. We have,
and they're
this
handwritten.
Handwritten. So you have no idea how accurate they are. No one has another record of them. I've once been told when I submitted one of these by the president's lawyer that there was a fire in his office and the share register was destroyed. So anyway, but one of the things that we did was to get the share registers of all of the Gupta companies. And we started tracking how had Duduzane Zuma, the president's son, how had his rise in the company correlated with his father's rise politically. And what you could see was entirely there was a direct correlation. As Zuma got back into power, as he became president, they just started cutting him into more and more and more deals until effectively he became one of their major shareholders in deals. From what we can tell, he didn't pay for any of the shares. He was simply gifted the shares. The interesting thing, though, is that they were very clever to always structure the company so that he never had direct controlling interest of anything.
Okay.
He effectively was a
puppet.
A pretty but not terribly engaged part of the conversation. So this is a lot of this was actually published before I joined Amabongane. This was when Amabongane was still part of the Mail and Guardian newspaper. And I think by 2016, when I joined, we had published 65 stories on the Guptas, investigative pieces, about their manipulation of the state, about how they were cutting Zuma's family members into deals, about how there was even a case where they were kind of bankrolling Zuma's wife's house that she bought, one of his wives. And we built up this very complex picture of who they were. Now, I mean, the first story that we published was in 2010. Okay. And then the Guptas were just kind of one of the many people who were circling around Zuma. But it became apparent by 2016 that, these people were
determined on, like, constant.
Yeah, were really the kind of key capturers of the state capture project within the state. So the question is, I mean, who was captured? The former president likes to say, well, if every part of the state wasn't captured, then how can you call it state capture? Which is ridiculous. But so there were kind of three main categories of people that the Guptas had sought to capture. First of all, the family members of the Guptas. You've got Duduzane Zuma and Bongi Ngema Zuma, one of Zuma's wives. The other category, which was very important, was Zuma's political allies. So, in South Africa, the ANC is traditionally ruled by a tripartite alliance with the Communist Party, the biggest trade union, COSATU, and the political party. But when those political allies didn't work for Zuma, he simply found new ones and built his own alliances. Now, what we saw was the Youth League of the party being a very central role, and you saw the Guptas, cozying up to the Youth League. The Umkhonto we Sizwe Military Veterans Association, which had been the armed wing of the ANC during apartheid, and was now a sort of veterans lobby group. you saw key figures within that organization being cut into mining deals by the Guptas and things like that. And then very importantly, the guy at the bottom there is Ace Magashule. So he forms part of what became the Premier League in South Africa.
Okay.
And what that refers to is that, South Africa is made up of various provinces. Each province is governed by a premier. Now, Zuma had built a sort of political alliance with certain provinces. These were not necessarily the biggest provinces or the most wealthy provinces or anything like that, but the three sort of henchmen, for lack of a better word, that became part of the Premier League were all premiers who sort of ruled with an iron fist in those provinces. And you saw the Guptas kind of going and making common cause with those members of the Premier League where they could, particularly with Magashule. But the most important group is the one in the middle. And it's made up of government ministers as well as the CEOs, CFOs, and chairs of South Africa's state-owned companies.
Okay.
Now, the reason that was so important was because, South Africa's state-owned companies are the biggest companies in the economy. Eskom, the electricity provider, employs something like 48,000 people. It's massive. Transnet, another which runs our trains and effectively then also runs our mining industry because we need those trains for the mining industry. Were very important parts of that. But there's some other key figures in there as well. David Mahlobo, the intelligence minister, that was an important part. The mines minister, very important as well. Even the communications minister, these were sort of key ministries that they were targeting.
And what about defense? Because I saw in the headings on the slide before that one that was part of the way the Guptas had related with Zuma, right? Through weapons.
Right, yeah. I mean, we have a couple of state-owned companies which produce a large amount of weapons and IP. Okay. They had really focused their attention there rather than on the military itself. The military itself in South Africa has largely stayed out of politics. It's very apolitical, luckily. So the focus really was on where are the contracts that one can get. And that's really why the state-owned companies became so crucial to the kind of capture project. So, I mean, if a couple of things to kind of describe of how, what does a captured state look like? So one of them was that you had massive capital projects in these huge state-owned companies being channeled towards companies that had either were Gupta-owned or where the Guptas had inserted themselves as gatekeepers, as middlemen with the companies. A very crucial part of the state capture project, though, was to shut down the investigative capacity of the state. So Zuma had come into power, having these corruption charges hanging over him, and he kind of systematically went about shutting down every part of the state that had the ability to investigate him or his allies. And so that meant the NPA, the prosecuting authority, that meant the Hawks, which is our elite police crime-fighting unit, SARS, a very, very important part of the equation, which is our revenue services, had started launching investigations into, tax investigations into some of these key figures. That was a key area that needed to be shut down. And then also the intelligence services, which could then be co-opted into investigating, Zuma's, his critics and his enemies. We also saw under the Zuma years a lot of very repressive legislation coming through. We were luckily able to push a lot of it back, but one of the worst was the secrecy bill, which had effectively it would have imposed prison sentences on anyone being in possession of a government document which was labeled top secret, secret, or classified.
So any whistleblower will be in jail for sure.
And any journalist. Okay. At one point the proposal was so ridiculous that if you as a journalist were in possession of a document that was labeled as classified, you were required to go to a police station, hand it over, disclose who your source was, and if you refused to do so, then you could face a jail sentence of, I think it was up to 10 years or so.
Oh my God.
So that was the kind of legislation that we saw coming through. We saw attempts by the state to start classifying certain things as national key points, which again, this was legislation that was used by the apartheid government, by a police state effectively, to control citizens. And we saw this type of legislation coming through. One of the other interesting dynamics, though, of the captured state was that one of the things the Guptas had very cleverly done was that they had started their own TV channel and their own newspaper. These weren't going to be profitable enterprises. They just weren't particularly well run, but they didn't need to be. They were happy
They were just PR.
They were PR, and they offered such a useful outlet to the government because, what it allowed. What could kind of come forward was that there was suddenly this alternative channel, this alternative narrative, which any time that any other member of the media started saying, but what about this corrupt deal? What about this? Government ministers could simply go, they wouldn't answer our questions, but they could go onto the TV channel and get a soft landing and be allowed to kind of spout these conspiracy theories about, how the media was out to get them, the media were agents, the media were various X, Y, and Z. And it really created the space for a kind of alternative facts universe to start to develop, which is something which we're grappling with now in South Africa, even though the Guptas are now out of the country.
But just like to circulate all, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like Zuma was trying to build his own dictatorship in a way, right? And he was being fueled by the Guptas in a way, because all the money and the resources were coming from his side, and he was able to transform the state into whatever he wanted it to be, fearing everyone that was outside his private circle and targeting media and activists and anybody who said, well, you're doing things wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really got to understand that properly when he appeared recently now at the State Capture Commission, because he was allowed to kind of paint his narrative of the state. And this is a president who never took the country into his confidence ever. And so it was the first time really that we were allowed to find out, okay, what does this guy actually think? And the picture that he painted was completely bizarre. He said basically his story is that towards the end of apartheid, various kind of domestic intelligence services as well as foreign intelligence services had gotten together and had decided that he could never become president. And everything that had happened since then, every time that he'd been accused of corruption, everything was part of this evil plan which had been put in place by these intelligence services. So yeah, I mean, he really was effectively hollowing out the state. Whether his goal was ultimate power or whether his goal was simply to prevent anyone from criticizing him, investigating him, or taking away his toys, I don't know. Okay. It's difficult to know, really, what his motivations were. I think it was clear, though, that a lot of the people around him saw that opportunity, that kind of, the sort of creeping autocratic tendencies, saw it as a wonderful opportunity to start looting the state, which is really what we saw. I wanted to just quickly show you this. This was the media defiantly refusing to, this was Zuma's house, which had been built with taxpayer money, and which the government tried to claim that no one could publish photos of because it was a national key point. Effectively, it was a secret installation. The media thoroughly ignored that, and everyone published it on their pages. So, I mean, this was very early on in the sort of Gupta years. So I think there was an antagonistic relationship with the media from early on. This was just before the Gupta Leaks came out, and I wanted to give you guys an idea of what we were sort of dealing with. The newspaper headline was around allegations that the Deputy Finance Minister, Nsibisi Jonas, who's pictured at the top there, that he had been offered a bribe of, I think it was 600,000 rand by the Guptas, and had been promised the position of Finance Minister. Now, the quotes below there are those did not come, we didn't know those at the time. Those would come out later after Zuma had stepped down when he testified at the State Capture Commission. So we knew that things were bad. We knew that they were this bad, the dark heart of state capture. We had no idea how bad it was, though. And that's something that we really only discovered later. But just for the benefit of translation, I'll just quickly read them to you. So this was Jonas testifying, and he said that the Guptas had said to him, "You must understand that we are in control of everything. The National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, the intelligence agency, the old man," which is a reference to the president, "will do anything we tell him to do." They then went on to say to him, "Do you know who you're dealing with? You think this is illegal? It's legal. Look, at the moment we make 6 billion rand from state companies. We want to grow to 8 billion rand, and Treasury is our stumbling block to our growth." And then at the end of the meeting, he says that they said to him, "You know, this meeting didn't happen. If you say anything to anyone, if you suggest this meeting occurred, we'll kill you." So this is them summoning the deputy finance minister of the country to their house, their personal house, and saying to them, "The finance minister is about to be fired. We'll make you finance minister, but you've got to agree to play ball with us."
Okay.
And that's what they wanted. I mean, essentially, at this point in South Africa's history, we were on the verge of signing an absolutely massive nuclear deal with the Russians. It was something which had been rammed through. It was very clear that there was a preference for the Russians, and it would have bankrupted the country. And the only thing standing in its way was Treasury, because Treasury could say, "Look, you can't sign that contract because it doesn't conform to regulations around public finances." And so this was their bid. What happened after this was that the finance minister was fired anyway. Jonas was not made the new finance minister because he refused. And the currency tanked overnight.
Wow.
What we later found out was that one of the companies, which was intimately linked with the Guptas, had actually bet against the currency. They knew that the finance minister was going to be fired. They knew it would send the currency into free fall, and they were able to do that. It's quite a complex story around bonds and things like that, but if it's ever something that you're looking at around currency manipulation, it's a good case study of how this type of thing can happen. So this was effectively where the story of the Gupta Leaks started for me. I didn't actually know that it had started months before, but I was in May 2017, I was asked by my editor to come and meet him on a rooftop parking lot in a shopping mall in Johannesburg. And we had to put all of our cell phones, laptops, anything digital into the car and then go and stand in the middle of the roof. And what he told me was that we had been given a hard drive. And this is not the actual hard drive, but this is essentially what it looked like. This does actually have a copy of the leaks on it now. So the story that he told me was, look, we have this hard drive. We were working with another company, Daily Maverick, and we were going to process this information. And he gave me an idea of what was on there. And it was things like how, the Guptas were able to, we had government ministers sending draft legislation to the Guptas to ask them if they wanted to change anything in the draft legislation. We had evidence of these massive prepayments being channeled to the Guptas. It was everything that we thought, and it was much, much, much worse. And effectively what they said to me was like, okay, look, do you want in on this? It's quite dangerous because as soon as, if anyone finds out we have this information, it's going to make us a target. It's going to make every individual who has this information a target. And they said, look, if you want to walk away and not be involved, we will completely understand. But obviously, I said, no, of course I want to be involved. But I mean, it was a genuinely quite a scary situation because we just didn't know. We didn't.
You were not able to dimension what you were getting into and who you were fighting against.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even know. We were so scared of the information that, and this is where I'll get into some of the logistics. We took a decision early on that we were not going to, that we had to stay offline with the information, which meant we had to buy brand new laptops. We had to kind of leave a trace on emails about why we needed, 8 new laptops. In case anyone was reading our emails, we didn't want it to be suspicious. We had to buy new hard drives to put the information on. We didn't quite... Grappling with the logistics was really difficult. For instance, one of the things was, because the emails, they exist like this. This is what they look like. It's nothing terribly exciting. So, that's the total count of the box. There are some duplicates in there, but 362,321 was the size of the box that we had. But, even getting basic things like putting Office onto those laptops.
That's really hard nowadays without Wi-Fi, right?
You have to go online. So we had this whole, we went through this whole elaborate process of it's going to be offline, but then we had to go online for things like, because we figured out that we would have to use Thunderbird to process the information. Outlook wasn't going to work. We had help from a sort of group called Code for Africa, which does a lot of sort of technical coding work. They were able to take all of these broken PST and Mbox folders for us, because it was one person within the Gupta Empire who had exported their emails, had archived them. And so we had all of these boxes that had to be brought together, turned into a single thing, and then put into a format that we could access. So, look, one of the problems that we faced as well is that we had no experience in dealing with such a large amount of information. And because we were so paranoid about going online, we couldn't go online and start searching, how do you process large amounts of data? We couldn't even call up, companies that do that to say, can you help us? Yeah. We had to sort of...
learn as you went.
We had to learn as we went along, and we really were limited to essentially Control F searches.
Oh, God.
This is what most people think, is like, did you have some amazing tech? No.
I think this is great that you bring it to light, because my data students now, they're starting to work with Excel. It's the first time they've been doing that. And they were so frustrated last week, because they were like, this is so hard on the data and getting the formulas in. And it's great that you say that most of the work is not nice, it's messy, it's hard, you have to do things you wouldn't like. It's not like a very interesting Hollywood movie. It's more like you in your laptop, having coffee, in your PJs, trying to figure out why this is not
Excel.
working.
Yeah, I spend more time on Excel than anything else. It's embarrassing how much time I spend on Excel, but it is amazing. It's when you're going to grapple with large amounts of information, you've got to make peace with Excel.
So keep your hearts up, my dear students.
But so this is essentially what we were dealing with, is we couldn't go through the information email by email. We couldn't start on email 1 and go down, because we wouldn't know the significance of what we were looking at. And, a lot of it is complete rubbish that's in there. Because the person whose email box we had was a sort of mid-level, not one of the brothers. He was kind of one of the enforcers. But he was really a sort of mid-level management person. He was also the CEO of one of the divisions, one of the companies. So there's a lot of emails in there about orders for computer parts and things like that. So we had to kind of start developing a system of how we would tackle this. But it really was a case of just having, we tried initially even keeping track of what searches we had done. Say, okay, I've done the search for, Zuma plus nuclear. There was nothing there, But that quickly went out the window, because you just start going down rabbit holes and you lose track of where you are. So it was an incredibly inefficient process, but it really was the only process that we could deal with at the time, because we didn't have the ability to reach outside and ask for help. One of the other logistical issues that we had, we decided, for the sake of security, that we couldn't process the leaks inside South Africa. The feeling is that the police, the intelligence services were too captured, and our lives would be in danger if we were doing it inside South Africa. So we decided that we would leave the country. We would go to somewhere in Europe. We felt that if you know, the Guptas were going to come after us in Europe, it would cause a diplomatic incident, and that would somehow be a deterrent. I don't know if the logic is right on that, but that's what we thought at the time. But even things like trying to figure out where do we go, because most of us are on South African passports, which means you can't just turn up at a border and say, hi, I'd like to stay. You've got to start applying for visas and, you know, and then there's like
to justify where you're taking a plane.
Like, how do you say to an immigration official, I just need to come hang out in your country for 3 months and just not tell you what I'm doing? So eventually we decided that we would go to Ireland, because it's one of the only places in the EU that South Africans can turn up at the border.
And it has great beer for those long nights of Excel, right?
Feels like there would be advantages, yeah. Although, you know, what we decided that we would do is we would rent a house. We wouldn't be allowed to tell anyone where we were going. We would be able to go once a week into a big city and contact home, but that would be the only contact that we would have. And there were, you know, there were real complications with that. I mean, we were allowed to tell our immediate partners what the plan was, because they obviously needed to know. But, you know, trying to explain to my mum why she can't contact me for 3 months it was going to be a nightmare. We also had, there's the issue of secrecy. One of the problems is we couldn't, because we couldn't communicate, even over encrypted messages or emails, we had to wait, because our managing partner, Stefans, and the editor of Daily Maverick, Branko, both of them were in Cape Town. Now, when they needed to meet, they had a secret code. They would send each other a panda emoji, and that would be their code for, like, we need to meet in the park in 15 minutes. And if you didn't make that meeting, you would just schedule another one. But we didn't have that ability, so we had to sit and wait in Joburg until one of them flew up and then could tell us what was happening. And, I mean, it was about a week before we were meant to leave. And we didn't know at that point that we were a week away from leaving. We had no idea. But Branko they had found a house in Ireland. They had made the payment for us to go and stay there for 3 months. There were going to be like 9 of us going. Luckily, the payment bounced because it was too big, or there was some issue with the credit card. Because that night, a source of mine let slip that there was something very big coming the next day in the Sunday newspapers. And what was coming, I'm going to come back to this, but what was coming was that both Sunday newspapers, a portion of the leaks had been given to the 2 Sunday newspapers who ran with it straight away. They obviously didn't know that there were complications behind it. One of the complications from our side was that the 2 whistleblowers were still in the country. One of the reasons that it took us so long to get going was that we knew that we needed to get the whistleblowers out of the country, which had all kinds of complications, because we couldn't just say to them, well, here's a plane ticket. We had to raise funds for them in order to effectively go and start a new life in other parts of the world, which raises all kinds of ethical questions as well, because that's not something we would normally do. You know, I mean, it's a non-negotiable that you don't pay for information. And this wasn't paying for information, but it did require a large amount of money to be raised, which meant going to various people who had the means and entrusting them with that secret and saying, there is this information, and the only way it's going to come out is if we protect these 2 people. This is the only view that we have of the whistleblowers. I've never met them. I don't know their real names. They are still outside of the country. They're known as Stan and John, but those are not their real names. And one of the huge problems was that they were still here. And so we had to break the news to them on a Saturday night that this was about to come out, and that they needed to not make plans to leave in 3 weeks or a month. They needed to leave this week. So that was one of the real complications for us, was to make sure that they got out in time. But in the end, the fact that the leaks had leaked, it wasn't a bad thing in the end, because what it meant was that you suddenly had not just us and Daily Maverick who had access to the information. You suddenly had the Sunday Times, you had News 24, you had City Press, you had all of the media in the country. Although they were initially given, a small sample, 200 emails out of the 300 and something thousand, it was, plenty for them to start publishing on. And in a way, that gave us safety in numbers. Because if the Guptas suddenly, or anyone else who was implicated in the leaks, if they had any ill intentions, at that point, there were suddenly 20 investigative journalists in the country who had copies of the leaks, and it was spread too far. So the possibility of suddenly being raided, all of that disappeared. Not immediately. We did have, safety briefings on, okay, if the police are at the bottom of the stairs, you have to drop your laptop out of this window down a stairwell, so hopefully it'll smash. But in the end, it worked out well. I mean, it wasn't what we had planned, but it became a positive thing for us. So once this was our way of organizing the information, once we could go online, it was just a really simple system of using Dropbox, assigning topics to different people. One of the really important things with the leaks, one of the reasons that we were able to get so much out of it is that we had a massive amount of information about the Guptas already, from investigating them for so many years. So we had a huge amount of information that we could draw on. I was having a look now, and the file that we had, the pre-Gupta Leaks file on the Guptas, already had 17,000 documents in it. So that was and a lot of the pieces of the puzzle in the Gupta Leaks, although the stuff was amazing that we found, it needed pieces from outside. It needed that trove of information, that 7 years of building up an understanding of how their empire worked, which deals they were participating in, where we'd heard rumors of them being in the background. Otherwise, I think without that, I'm not sure that we would have got more than just the superficial stories.
And I think that's a very important thing to have in mind, because sometimes people believe, like with Panama Papers or the Swiss leaks, that until you have a leak, then you can do nothing.
Yeah.
And that's not true. Actually, the more you do before, if you ever have a leak, it's what's going to make that leak matter. If not, then you're just going to have a lot of Excels and different dynamic tables and maybe a story, but not like the real juice behind the data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we do constantly is we build up files on people. One of the things that I say to people is, if you get a piece of information, a viable reaction to that piece of information is to file it. OCR it, make it searchable, make sure you've got access to it, but file it. It doesn't mean that it's something that you have to act on immediately. And I think with most of the investigations that we've done, it's because we have chipped away slowly at the investigation. I mean, I was chatting to a journalist the other day from the New York Times, and they had kind of said, oh, well, at the New York Times, you'd be told, well, this story's not ready yet. We took a different approach. We were willing to publish for years saying, there's something here. It's not definitive proof. I can't prove this to you definitively, but we can see the Guptas here. There's something strange with this deal. And we sometimes got a lot of flack for that, for saying that these were speculative stories, but it was absolutely crucial. And again, it was one of those things that allowed us to put up a flag and say to sources out there, we're interested, we're investigating.
Susan, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes so you can wrap the story, because the students want to ask questions and they've already given me the signal of moving on. So.
I'm going to quickly then run through some of the stuff that we found. So this was one of the biggest finds in the leaks. One of the documents that we found was a business development agreement between a complete non-entity in Hong Kong called Tequesta and the largest rail company in the world, China, well, it's now called CRRC. At the time, it was China North and China South Rail. They had bid for contracts with Transnet. The contracts were worth, I think, around 25 billion rand. The kickback, which we could see from this spreadsheet, and this is one of the amazing things, is that the Guptas kept incredibly detailed records. They kept spreadsheets because they needed to keep track of all their money. this detailed what the kickbacks would look like. The kickback alone on this, and we say kickback in inverted commas, it's a commission fee, it's a kickback, was 5.3 billion rand out of these 3 train deals. This was just a small detail I wanted to show you. You know, there were a number of anonymous email accounts in the Gupta Leaks that we couldn't identify who the person was because they were very careful not to leave traces. But there were ways of doing that. One of the most prolific ones was this one, infoportal@zoho.com, businessman. If you look at number 3A, 3B, and number 3, you can see this was effectively how we identified that Salim Essa was behind that particular email address. Because what had happened was that Infoportal had sent a letterhead to one of the Gupta lieutenants. If you look at the metadata on that, we could see that Salim Essa had authored the letter. We could see what time he had authored it, 1 minute before it was sent. And we could see that it was a letterhead for a company that he had owned. Now, the likelihood of someone being able to author that document and send it within that minute and there be multiple chains, it's just not realistic. So it was things like that where we were just using basic things like metadata just to extract information out of the leaks. This was some of the things that we found. Hotel bills for the Oberoi Hotel in Dubai. We were able to see, I mean, the people here, you've got the CFO initially of Transnet and then of Eskom. You've got the guy who was in charge of coal procurement at Eskom. You've got the president's son, the chairman of Denel, the arms company, and the then CEO of Transnet. All of them were making these pilgrimages to Dubai. And no one knew. No one knew that they were turning up there. But what we could see was that the Guptas were being sent the bills for all of these trips. We could also see where chauffeurs were being arranged to pick these guys up and take them to the Gupta's house in Dubai. Another thing that we were able to see was how key people within state-owned entities, they were using their private email accounts to send confidential documents to the Guptas. One of the examples here, you had Machela Koko, who was involved with coal procurement in Eskom, sending a message saying, please give, it's to the boss, the fight begins. And it's kind of one of those questions of like, who was the boss that he was referring to? Who was the boss that he was reporting to? This was another very important discovery that we made in the leaks. This diagram was pieced together from a mammoth number of Excel spreadsheets, which the Guptas had used to keep track of their money laundering operation, how money had been moved from what was meant to be a project to benefit impoverished farmers in the Free State. It had been laundered through just about every trick in the book and through a wide range of different companies in Dubai. And what it had been used for was to pay for the Gupta's niece's wedding. So you had money that instead of going to farmers had essentially ended up being spent on chocolate truffles and silk scarves. The reason I put KPMG there is that this is essentially why KPMG in South Africa took such a massive hit. They were auditing these companies, and not all of them, but they should have seen enough to know what was happening.
And they didn't say anything.
They didn't. They later half the partners in the firm resigned over this, and they agreed to return the money. But I mean, effectively, the damage was catastrophic to KPMG. They lost all their government business. This was another type of thing that we would find: fake invoices being generated to move money along the train. And when you go into these invoices and you say, "Here's a company which has one employee and is supposedly buying computer services from Sahara, the Gupta's company, for 122 million rand." Well, that's a problem. These are clearly fake invoices, and all they were designed to do was to pick up the money from one of the state-owned entities and under the guise of commissions and then disguising it as IT services, move it along the train to its ultimate destination. This was another big find in the leaks, the global software company SAP. Very important, what we found there is that they were, again, business development fees. They were using these kind of, this company in question was a company that sold 3D printers.
Okay,
It's 50% owned by the Guptas. And they were the contracts that they were signing with them was saying, if you get us this contract, this government contract, if you are the effective cause, we will give you, initially it was 10%, it was then increased to 14.9%. And through that system, they ended up paying over 100 million rand to these Gupta companies. Now, when we went and questioned SAP and said to them, what was this company doing that they were going to get you this contract? They kind of gave us these vague excuses about, no, we needed 3D models of the train yards for Transnet, and so they were able to print those, and we were like, oh, come on, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
What you could see as well, and that was really important for us, is once you started looking into these companies, which was damning because SAP had the right to do that. They had the right to go and audit their partners and see where the money was going. You saw the money going into CAD House, and immediately, on the same day, the money just starts leaving.
Yeah.
And one of the companies there, Bursar Projects, this is literally where it ends up. The company exists as nothing more than a PO box. And one of the sort of shocking things for me was how quickly things moved out of a legitimate company like SAP and into an absolute black box. This was another important thing that happened during the Gupta Leaks time is Bell Pottinger, the UK PR firm, they had come up with a campaign to divert attention away from criticism of Gupta's, criticism of Zuma, by drawing attention to the fact that South Africa is still massively defined by race, that there is still the initial phrase was economic apartheid, which is a reality in South Africa. Race still determines so much of one's opportunity. The problem is that the Guptas then took that and ran with it. This was a pretty weird one. For some reason, the Gupta trolls had an obsession with the idea that I was having a love child with my editor, Sam, which was really weird. But this was the type of thing that we saw. The media suddenly we were being branded as right-wing agents, as agents of white monopoly capital was the kind of chosen phrase, of Stratcom. Stratcom was a particular reference to the apartheid government's use where they had planted agents within media houses in order to manipulate the narrative against the struggle. So it's a very damning thing to start calling someone that. You're essentially saying that you're an apartheid agent. Now, I mean, this stuff was weird, and it was. People quickly called it out on Twitter. I don't know if we have time to very quickly play that town hall video. Probably, if you turn the sound down, I'll carry on talking over it. But it sort of had kind of knock-on consequences in the real world. We had people coming and protesting outside our offices. Although they actually got the wrong office, they went to another media house, which was kind of funny. But kind of coming and protesting and saying, why are you investigating the Guptas? Why aren't you investigating, white-owned companies and things like that? So it kind of became part of the narrative. This was a town hall event that we had just to tell people about the leaks, to share information, that we had a group of protesters turn up and start kind of disrupting the event, pushing people around. It was a pretty weird sort of time. That's my editor being pushed over. But effectively, and this is kind of one of the legacies that survived after the Guptas. So even though, eventually the Guptas disappeared, they had tapped into something so real in South Africa. They had tapped into the kind of raw racial nerve in South Africa. And this is the sort of legacy that's now surviving. We're now seeing, those same strange memes about how, we're agents of white monopoly capital, how we're apartheid spies, that kind of thing. We're seeing those same memes being used again. And part of that, which you can cut it there. Part of that, I'll just very quickly. Although one of the things is that eventually that's a list of the companies that were eventually implicated, as well as all of the ministers and government people. I'll come back to that later. What we saw, despite all of the kind of propaganda that was thrown at us, was that there was a massive surge of public support. There were public protests calling for Zuma to step down. And eventually he did. Eventually he was forced to step down on Valentine's Day last year, which is the best Valentine's Day gift I've ever received. We had a new president who was sworn in, Cyril Ramaphosa, and we have a number of commissions of inquiry that have been set up. We had parliamentary commissions of inquiry, we had the State Capture Commission, the Empati Commission, all of these commissions that are now tasked with investigating what happened. And I'd like to say that that's where the story ends, but of course it doesn't, because what we have seen, if 2017 was the year of state capture, 2018 was the year of what was termed the New Dawn, 2019 has become the year of the fight. And effectively what's happening is that the people who were implicated in state capture have formed a kind of coalition of the wounded, and are sort of starting to push back. And we're seeing the same attacks coming back again. We're seeing the same social media attacks coming back at us. The poster on the right, that was a book which one of my colleagues who'd worked on the Gupta Leaks had written about one of the members of the Premier League. He'd written a book exposing massive corruption that Ace Magashule had been involved in. The youth league of the ANC, the youth league of the ruling party, organized an event to burn the books. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. We're seeing a massive populist surge in South Africa. We're seeing a kind of social media being dominated by trolls and by bots and by sort of actors who seem intent on polarizing the country. And it's a strange place to be in, and it's kind of making us go back and reassess, where are we? It's making us redraw the circles and say, what is the shape of the new fight that we're facing? And that's really where we are.
Similar situations in all of the countries. But I want to give the word to the students. So anybody who has a question, you can pose the question in Spanish if you prefer, and we'll translate it for you. Or if you want to do it in English, that's fine too. So anybody that has a question, please raise your hand so you can be handed the mic. Are we going to give them this one, or do you have one for
No, they're good.
Should
I have... en español, como quieras.
English would be
Como
better.
quieras.
En español mejor, creo que es un poco más cómodo para todos. Tengo dos preguntas. La primera, hablamos de periodismo investigativo, pero suena un poco redundante, ¿no? Porque todo periodismo debería ser investigativo. ¿Qué diferencia realmente el periodismo investigativo? ¿Cómo determinamos qué es periodismo investigativo y qué es periodismo normal? Sí se puede determinar. Y segundo, ¿cómo contar las historias de periodismo investigativo? Creo que es muy importante no solo que investigar, tener los datos, las fuentes, sino cómo transmitir esa información. ¿Cuál es como tu approach a esa situación?
Okay, so the question is a little bit long. So the first one, he was talking about the investigative journalism, and he wants to know why it's so, sometimes contradictory in the way that the investigations are taking place. So he wants to know how to do a good investigation journalism, or to be part of it. The first question, right?
So, yeah.
The term investigative journalism, because
Yes.
journalism should
Is
what determines the difference, or what determines what is actually for you.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and it's a debate that we always have, because it is difficult to say that's not an investigative story. I tend to think that, and I mean that's why we do a lot of training with journalists across Africa and in South Africa around providing investigative tools and techniques, so that people can start to incorporate them into journalism wherever they are, whether they're in a newsroom and their title is not investigative journalist, to sort of put those best practices of journalism in place, and to start incorporating some of the really interesting and quick techniques that investigative journalism can kind of offer. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we also grapple with is we've gone through a period where it was enough to put the information out there and trust that people understood why it was so important. For a variety of reasons, partly because there's massive corruption fatigue in South Africa, it's harder and harder to get through to people. There's also a kind of, we're pushing up against kind of alternative narratives that don't like the narrative of corruption, and that want to kind of say, no, the media is corrupt, you're paid. So I think we are finding it harder and harder to really reach people and get across. One of the things that we're spending more and more time doing is to learn the skills to learn better narrative skills, to write better. Because, we have too often been criticized of like, this is a really important story, but I'm not going to read 8,000 words of technical detail. I think one of the things that we've tried to do as well is to try and remove some of the forensic detail from our stories. We've always felt it's so important that we tell everyone every single thing that we found. What we have now on our website is a little feature that we've added called an evidence docket, and essentially, unless a piece of evidence is very sensitive and we can't publish it, we put that piece of evidence into the docket. And so we can take it out of the story. And we can say to people, we can just link it in the story. Or we can say to people, go and explore the evidence for yourself. If you don't like what we're saying, if you're not convinced by it, go and explore it. It's in Dropbox. You can even leave comments next to the document. You can point and show arrows and tell us if you think we got it wrong. People never do, and it often, is quite a good way of sort of dealing with trolls. But part of that effect is really to allow us to stop trying to hammer people over the head with every piece of evidence that we find. But it's been a difficult lesson for us, and one that we don't always get right, and one that we're having to learn. The luxury of publishing online allowed us to publish 8,000 words. That doesn't mean we should publish 8,000 words on every story.
Tenemos espacio para 3 preguntas más, entonces quien quiera hacerlas, se les pasará un micrófono.
Hi. Well, my question is, in terms of investigative journalism, how do you work in the topic without violating the laws of the country? Because it could be a little contradictive, I think, if in terms of, for example, corruption, because sometimes when people try to hide things, you need to violate their privacy, but it's part of the law and the rights. So how do you work in those terms?
I think a lot of the time it tends to come down to ethical issues rather than legal ones. We're very clear in terms of what we can and can't do legally. We can't access people's phone records. We can't access their bank accounts. That's off limits. We do, if someone gives us copies of bank accounts, we can use them. But we, provided that we haven't commissioned someone, asked someone to go and, to dig for us. But there are some really difficult ethical issues. One of another journalist recently did a story where they had gone to this sort of luxury house which had been rented by Julius Malema, the leader here of the EFF, by him and his party for a week. And she went and dug through their rubbish to find what had come out of it. And it was one of those stories that really polarized people. Older journalists tended to say, hey, when I was, a cub reporter, we were told the first thing you do is you go and dig through people's rubbish. There were a lot of people who felt that was completely unethical. But it did unearth some interesting sort of information. I mean, I think one of the things that we were able to satisfy ourselves with the Gupta Leaks is that the information had not been obtained illegally. It hadn't been hacked. The details of exactly how it was obtained, that still hasn't come out, and hopefully it will in due course. But that made it a lot easier for us because we had legal opinions from our lawyers who could say, you're in safe territory, they're in safe territory. I'm trying to think of some other examples, but I mean, look, there are laws which we are willing to break. Technically, in terms of the National Key Points Act, we can't go and take a picture of a power station. Now, I'm not going to not go and film how, trucks are having to deliver coal by road because someone has, corruptly given a contract to X, Y, and Z. I'm still going to do that. Because the public interest defense is really strong. We're very lucky in South Africa as well that the courts are very progressive when it comes to the media. They're very good at recognizing what is in the public interest. But we also do have a media ombud, a press council, which adjudicates. We choose to be part of it, and they can rule against us. The instances, though, of people actually suing journalists for anything illegal is pretty much non-existent.
Por cuestiones de tiempo, tenemos espacio para una pregunta más.
Okay, here. So I think at this moment, political corruption has become kind of a main target for investigative journalism. And I think one of the most important things about investigative journalism is that it actually has a power to make a change in society. But talking about the case here in Colombia, where we have to face all this political corruption, mostly every day, I think, maybe. So what do you think is that the most important thing for journalism to actually have that power to make a change?
It's a really tough one. We're in a similar situation. We're also just inundated with political corruption. It's like non-stop. And one of the debates that we have all the time is, what is that taking us away from? If there is evidence of politicians engaging in corruption, it feels very difficult to say, no, we're not going to publish that. But at the same time, this kind of constant feed of political information, it does mean that we don't get to go and investigate the corruption that starts with a service delivery protest. And that's a really difficult thing for us. One of my colleagues recently, she's been investigating chemical toilets in informal settlements in South Africa. So in kind of, where you don't have proper housing built, where housing is built from, wooden and corrugated iron shacks, where a lot of South Africans still live. And, she went to go and investigate because there were complaints about this contract for issuing of portable chemical toilets. Turns out that there actually was massive corruption, and it led very quickly back to political corruption. But the people that she was speaking to when she was going into these townships were saying, look, you don't understand how long we've been complaining about this. We've written letters, we've written to the media, no one cares. We're at the point where we're going to set stuff on fire just to get attention, because that's the only way you guys are going to come. So, I mean, look, I think it's a difficult balancing act for us, and I don't know that we've figured it out. We try to focus on direct evidence of corruption, direct evidence of things like influence peddling, and try to stay out of the factional political battles. But one of the things that really concerns me is how much of the media's space is taken up by political infighting in South Africa, and I would imagine that you guys face a similar kind of dilemma.
Oh, it's the exact same way. We have a very polarized country because of political parties, and most of our headlines on our news media space is about this one said that one, and this politician has been sued, and all that fight and corruption gets in the way. But then again, if you're tackling what this guy said and this guy said, then you have little time to go to the Amazon forest and see how cocaine is just poisoning our rivers, for instance, So yeah, that is true. I think we don't have more time for questions, or are we good?
Actually, yeah, we don't have more time.
Okay, so thank you, Susan, for being here with us. I think it was a beautiful and very informative and wonderful conversation we had with you. It's always great to have great journalists as you talking to us and giving all of these young minds ideas on how to do things and how to not settle and how to try different ways to tell stories. And I want to thank all of you for being here and bearing with us despite the language difficulty, but I think it was a great opportunity for all of us to learn, and we hope this club becomes something we can all learn from and explore more, and of course all of your ideas and proposals are more than welcome, and I bet Juan Camilo will be more than happy to have all of your ideas come to him to figure new ways to give this club a bigger life. So thank you for being here with us, and we hope to have another chat soon.